All right, so we got a plasma cutter. This is a nice little plasma cutter. It should be able to cut through 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch steel fairly easily. You can definitely cut through, sheet steel really pretty quickly. This is rusty, crusty material. It's still gonna work, right? Generally, when you're welding, you want clean metal because you don't want any contaminants in your weld. When you're cutting, as long as it's making a contact between your ground and your positive, it will cut. Excuse me. I'm gonna talk again. Did you get that on video? I need to drink water, I think. A lot of talking. So I'll draw my line on here. I can follow my line. I can cut straight. I can put a bar. I can take a bar of steel, 1/4 inch steel as a straight edge, clamp it with 2 C-clamps if I want to do a straight cut. I can draw with a piece of soapstone because it's not going to burn away when I get the heat on it. Soapstone's white and it will burn away, so I can draw my line with that and follow it fairly easily. This is gonna basically do the same thing that a torch would do. It's just it doesn't cut as hot, and there's a much cleaner line. It's much easier to use. It's using arc technology. So it's the same thing when you take a positive and negative of a battery and you put it together and it sparks. That's essentially what a welder is, right? A welder is using that energy, electrical energy, to melt the metal and deposit it as a weld. Well, this is using it to cut it. So we have air and we have electricity cutting this metal. First thing we're going to do, we're going to pull out our air hose and we're going to put it into our plasma cutter hose. In order to do this, some of them you just put them together and they click together. Most of them you got to pull the collar down, press it in, push the collar up. Now this one has a little bit of a hiss to it. Sounds like it's a little bit of a leak of air. Could be that somebody was grinding or welding near that hose and made a little tiny hole. It's not going to stop us from running. There's a regulator on top. You don't need to mess with that. We're only cutting thin gauge metal with this. So leave it at the pressure that it's at. And that's going to blow, it's going to melt the metal and the air is going to blow the metal out of the way. This is your amperage. Your amperage needs to be dialed up or down depending on how thick of metal that you're working with. 18, 22, 25. And it says A, that's amperage, right? So that might not correlate or make sense to you. What does that even mean? A lot of people, they just crank it up to the max to cut whatever they're going to cut. That's hard on the machine. It's also hard on the machine if you don't have dry air. We have an air drying setup on our compressor which keeps the air dry without moisture in it. All of those things will eat up the machine. This is the 220 machine. It's got a 220 plug on it. There's a big heavy extension cord coming from the 220 plug across the room. We also have one of these that's a 110. It'll plug into a regular receptacle. 110, can anybody guess what a 220 can do that a 110 can't do?
Twice as much?
DC?
Well, no, it cuts
Thicker metal.
thicker metal. It's got twice as many volts. It allows it to have a higher amperage as well. So I'm set up. I got my air in here. I'm going to turn my machine on. And I'm going to get my safety equipment ready. This is generally what a lot of people use to cut with. You can use a welding hood. This is a shade 5 cutting goggles. A lot of people use these with a torch. These are also shade 5 cutting glasses, safety glasses. Do not assume, I wanted to point these out because I use these a lot of the time, but these are shaded and they're rated to shade 5. They are safety glasses. These aren't just regular sunglasses. Do not try to do this with regular sunglasses. It's not the end of the world. You're going to be doing small cuts, but if you don't protect your eyes, you can potentially get a sunburn on your eyes. from a torch, definitely from a welder, and potentially from a plasma cutter. The minimum you want when you're doing plasma cutting, minimum you want for pretty much the most torch or cutting stuff is shade 5. I know a lot of people that will go to shade 10 when they're cutting on a plasma cutter, mainly just because they're wearing their welding hood and they jump from the welder to the plasma cutter. Shade 5 is fine. It's also easier to see. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make sure I have my ground clamp. That's this guy. The ground clamp is clamped directly to my metal. That generally gives me a better contact. And then I'm going to make sure that my wand is clear. We have electrodes in here. There's all sorts of components that make up. There's a swirl ring, and this is a gouging tip. So I can cut straight into the center of this and pierce out a circle if I wanted to. So I'm gonna try it, see if I can cut straight down in, cut a little hole, and then come and cut the piece off. Keep in mind that all of your sparks are going to be dropping here. So if I'm cutting, it's potentially sparks and slag are going to hit my hose. And they want to work on the other side to keep that from happening. This is a cutting table because it's got the openings in it for stuff to fall through. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce this and cut the circle. And then I'm going to cut it straight. There's a button on the back. That's all I got to do is press that button. It'll start, and then I can introduce it to the material. When I first introduce it to the material, there's nowhere for it to go. It's blowing air. It's going to want to blow it up and out and around. Once I'm cut through, it's going to throw it straight down. So that's what you want to be aware of and ready for. It didn't cut all the way through, that's fine. That's because the slag is still holding on to it. I may find that I need more amperage if I'm not cutting all the way through. That's when I'll play with this. There's a fairly small hole for something I would cut with a plasma cutter, so there's enough surface area for everything to grab onto. I'm going to go ahead and cut this off. Generally, when you start, this does not have a drag tip. So drag tip is an extra protecting component that keeps you from touching the metal with this. You want to float this just above your metal. You don't want to touch the metal. You don't want to touch it into the metal, which can be a little bit difficult unless you have a drag tip on there. And I can show you that later. So I'll start it outside, and I'll cut through, and I'm moving slowly, right? So my sparks are flying down. If they start flying back up, I know that I'm moving too fast because I didn't cut all the way through. So it didn't drop, sometimes when you get it, so I didn't quite cut through in some places. So I could just hit this with a hammer and get it to drop loose, or I could come back in those places that I didn't quite hit, I could try and release it again. Notice that it continues blowing air for a little while. That's to clear the nozzle, and if you want to start back up again. So I'm going to start back up and see if I can cut that loose all the way. So at this point, I'm pretty confident that I'm all the way through. and I can just break that loose. Now this is hot. I've got leather gloves on, but it is hot. I can see that I'm moving that circle. It's now popping out a little bit, but there's a little bit that's not quite cut through all the way. So I can probably punch that out with a little hammer or with a punch and be fine. Any questions about the plasma cutter?